Here we are at essayette number 11. It's called concept, a word that any opera devotee will recognize as a source of controversy in recent decades. This is a little longer than some of the others, so I shall attempt to keep my answers to a couple of questions succinct. Concept. A concept is a thought or idea that gathers a set of particulars into a general notion. Since the term is used glibly and vaguely with reference to the performing arts, a few distinctions are in order. A concept is not the same as a subject, topic, or theme. True, these terms share with concept a concern with the meaning, the aboutness of a work. But subject, topic, or theme implies something to be addressed, developed, discoursed upon. They suggest a dynamic potential. Concept has a fixed quality. It stands for the attempt to pin down the thing that it is in idea form. Because of this fixed quality, the concept of concept would appear to be applicable more to the fine arts than to performance. Indeed, the several varieties of art categorized as conceptual are unified in their attempts to be about idea rather than about their materials or processes or their putative content or meaning. They aspire to create images of concepts. Whether or not they actually do so is debatable. The shifty nature of creativity, with its endless sorting through its fields of choice, would seem to argue against the likelihood of directly rendering even the simplest, most tightly bound concept into an expressed object. In terms of the artist-receptor encounter, though, this problem is of little importance. It is certainly possible to create a work that instructs the receptor to search it for its idea, and that refuses the viewer's satisfaction if seen in any other way. It will either be thing that it is, simultaneously derivative and descriptive like meaning, or will be deflected by the receptor and therefore nothing to him. And I see a marginal comment here, quote, I would be into CLO unpacking this more here, unquote. Not sure exactly what that's getting at, but I'll take a crack at it. I discern three ways of deriving meaning from art. Any art, but in our case, opera. The first is through its manifest content. Theatrically, that means plot and character in the foreground, physical and societal environment in the background, all presented directly and without comment, so to speak, and with the plot and character developments seen as logically connected to the physical and societal environment, representing behavior that could be expected to happen in that context and to be influenced by it. Musically, it means the ways that music makes those elements and relationships dramatically present to the ear. So, to take a sample scene of high dramatic import that we all know, wherein things happen right out there in the open, let's say the triumphal scene in Aida, we have this enormous presentation of environment, a great celebration with dances and choruses and processions, very atmospheric and to us exotic in its time and place identity. And yet the point of the scene is the way personal dramas of romantic entanglement and conflict, patriotism, love versus duty, all of which transcend time and place, are enfolded within this environment, which asserts its dominance to the end, yet recedes in emotional importance to us as the scene progresses. The personal drama comes forward, and we continue to search it out even when it's half buried to the ear in parts of the concluding ensemble. The eye, which had been scanning the scene as a whole, now zeroes in on the actions and attitudes of the principal characters, and we track the progress of the plot set against this huge panorama by both eye and ear. This is something, incidentally, that is often largely lost on recordings, where the solo voices are unnaturally highlighted, or on video, which can't take in the whole scene and has to isolate individuals or small groupings whose relationship to the onstage community is blurred. Only the theater gives us the ear-eye trade-offs and blendings written in by the creators. In the theater, if all this is produced and performed straightforwardly and more or less representationally, that's a manifest content way of performing it, as the creators conceived it. And that is what I mean by putative content or meaning, wherein the things emphasized in performance are the things that we in the audience would take as the obvious way of receiving them, the way that does not require extra explanation or translation. That is why I'm calling the manifest content way was, for most of operatic history, the normative way. Then there's a second way, which I indicated in my reference to materials and processes, which is a slightly roundabout way of introducing the subject of structure, how a piece of art is made, and of materials, what it's made of. Naturally, all artworks have structure, even the sorts of music we call aleatoric, or the kinds of theater we term improvisational, can be inspected for structure or a kind of madeness and be found to have some. But some forms of art ask for us to receive them in terms of their structures and materials. The structures and or materials are the point, are in themselves where meaning is to be found. In the fine arts and their uses in stage design, the Russian style of Constructivism is one example. Another is abstract expressionism, summed up in the critic Clement Greenberg's dictum, "There is only paint and canvas." At least he's supposed to have said that. Which is to say, don't be looking here for content in any representational sense. Look for the impact of the materials themselves. And this is echoed in all the form follows function developments we live with in modern design. Now, in opera and classical music, structure and forms per se are certainly things we can profitably listen for. We learn about sonata form, we learn to listen for the working out of counterpoint or a fugue, or to recognize the operatic conventions I spoke about last time with respect to Il Trovatore. And we learn the satisfactions of arrival at a destination, a consummation by a route we've taken before, but along which the scenery is always new. Yet in opera, even opera in which the conventions are immediately recognizable, in performance, we are usually being asked to forget about the forms and give ourselves over to the emotional, sensory, and aesthetic effects being created. And as I noted last time, as the 19th century proceeded, opera rights pushed toward a through-composed ideal, according to which structure would be only subliminally perceived. This was for the sake of dramatic continuity, of a more lifelike and therefore more believable way of presenting a stage world. After all, though our lives do contain strictly boundaried events, by and large, we don't live in episodes or movements. Our lives, especially our inner lives, just keep on going. So this disappearance of convention, this sort of going underground of musical structure is toward that dramatic end and has the effect of concealing musical structure in order to foreground cinetic progressions until we arrive at a case like that of Alban Berg's Waltzek. There has never been a more formalist opera than Waltzek, both musically and dramatically. Musically, every scene is constructed on a pure music form, a passacaglia, a sonata form movement, an invention in fugue, a theme and variations, and so on. Dramaturgically, the scenic progression was made into a taut, suspenseful, linear narrative by the composer's selection of scenes and their ordering from the unordered materials Büchner left for his unfinished play, Waltzek. And then the whole sequence was laced up in the interludes that connect the scenes. The piece is an intricate web of structure in both the vertical and horizontal dimensions. Yet Berg didn't want us to listen for the forms or think about the structure. He wanted them to act as a dimly sensed engine driving the action forward, so that this complex of formal devices would be received as the simplest, most natural sort of storytelling for the stage, and our attention and emotional engagement would be held by the story. Well, I've been talking here about structure, form, materials, becoming progressively concealed in the name of dramatic believability. But there is music, there is theater, that wants to be seen and heard for its structure. And there are interpreters in chief, conductors, directors, designers, who wish to bring out the structural elements in anything they interpret. So, while our sample scene of Aida was created for a manifest content presentation, it is perfectly possible to imagine a direction design team, perhaps coming from a post-imperialist, anti-oppression POV, deciding to underline the rigid, suffocating feel of the society that has the protagonists enmeshed by showing the mechanical, ritualistic nature of all the scenetic actions and of the onstage behavior on a looming abstract set of a form follows function type that has no decorative purpose, aided by a conductor who sharply marks off every episode and every excuse for blunt contrasts within the episodes, strips away as much color as he can from the skeletal gestures of the music, and deliberately enforces a mechanistic rendering of rhythm and tempo. Not to mention a choreographer who turns the dances into marionette-like pantomimes, clearly anchored to these gestures and rhythms. That would be a structuralist reinterpretation of a scene conceived along traditional lines. But then you might have another structure-oriented team come along and say, no, this post-imperialist loss is just a return to content. We must work for pure form, structure for its own sake, not to interpret. Exactly how they'd go at the triumphal scene in Aida, I can't really imagine, but in any case, they would soon be moved aside by a new team that declares that no, now we are in a post-dramatic theatrical era, and these structural approaches are obsolete because they leave the narrative in place, however distorted it may be. Content is dead, narrative and coherent structure as well. There can be no further progress in art as we have known it, because, as the noted art critic Arthur Danto has said, art has collapsed into philosophy. Therefore, the material must be deconstructed and searched only for its idea, which is to say, its concept, which the material must be made to convey. And that is an impossible task when it comes to the triumphal scene of Aida, because as I try to convey in the essayette, an idea or concept is abstract, impersonal, unitary, and static, while dramatic theater of any sort is personal, conflicted, and dynamic. Of course, neither of these last two groups, the pure structure folks or the pure idea art philosophers, are at all likely to be found anywhere near Aida, I think. I've just used the example to illustrate the progression from what I call the manifest content assumption, or you can call it pre-modern or traditional if you prefer, to the how it's built one, which we associate with what we call the modern, and which in literary theory and philosophy is termed structuralism, and finally to the ideational one, which is an aspect of the postmodern named post-structuralism. I hope also that it makes clear that opera, as we think of it, is a poor fit with the modern and a complete misfit with the postmodern. Before getting back to the body of the essayette, I see there's one more question here from Jennifer, which I guess arises from the fact that as we talk about concept, she recalls that it was Robert Wilson's production of Lohengrin that goaded me into starting my book. And perhaps she has seen the production and liked it, or at least found it harmless, because her question is, quote, Lohengrin, double question mark, why does it not work, unquote. The full answer is in the very next chapter of the book, entitled Bob Does Dick, which takes 16 pages plus a page of notes to get us started by detailing my objections to the production. So I'll just tease out a couple here and let me preface them with my strenuous objection to this question of does it work? As I note in the book, in a downtown production called Bob, a sort of theatrical probing of Wilson's person and way of working, the great climax of the Lohengrin prelude was accompanied by the slow, closely timed downing of a glass of milk, the last gulp coming right at the fortissimo chord with the cymbal crash, all of us in the little theater down on 4th Street, completely engulfed by the sound. It worked. Big impact. Hairs back of neck. That glass of milk must be really, really important in some deep, mysterious way. So the lesson we are meant to draw is anything can work, provided you have Wagner's music, good timing, and a good sound system. But what does it have to do with Lohengrin? Not a blessed thing. It has to do with the meaning of the glass of milk to Bob, a bit of his private iconography, which was half explained in the course of this smart little theater piece. So the lesson I draw is that if anything can be made to work, then working has no value whatever. And the question isn't whether it works or not, but whether or not it contributes to the consummation of the artwork in question, according to its rules and aesthetics, as set forth by its creators, all of them, in this case, being named Richard Wagner. So, to these sample aspects I was going to tease out, one is goddamn slow-mo, which, as you probably know, is a defining characteristic of Wilson's work, not only in his original pieces, but in his interpretations of the works of others. In the book, I discuss the effect of slow-mo as we receive it in the theater, which is to invite us to inspect, to analyze, to examine, as we do by slowing down film to the point of a stopped frame, and in doing so, put the music, at whatever tempo it's moving, on background and substitute an intellectual kind of attention, eye-dominant, for the ear-led, visceral one implied by the music and the progress of the story. This is part of a belief held by some of postmodern persuasion in the efficacy of separating the elements of a work so that they make simultaneous but independent statements rather than reinforcing one another. In other words, reversing Wagner's central principle of stagecraft, that of integrating all of the elements into a Gesamtkunstwerk and disassembling it into one of an Ungesamtkunstwerk. So I object to that on all possible grounds. There's one more problem with slow-mo, a very practical performance problem I don't mention in the book, and that is its effect on the energies of the performers, the necessity of somehow conforming the state of being of the acoustical singing actor in some of the most energy-intensive dramatic music ever written with the state of being of a living mannequin, or at best, Tai Chi practitioner. I've worked with two singers who, during their times of working with me, had major roles in Wilson productions in major venues. Both gave me unsolicited reports of the extreme, exhausting constraints associated with that. And while we have no way of doing an A-B comparison of how they sang in Wilson's Lohengrin versus how they might have sung in one more traditional on the singing to physical action plane, they both felt hampered, and slow-mo certainly can't have helped them. And this slow-mo is part of another strand I'll tease out, which is the imposition of a Wilsonian aesthetic on the Wagnerian one, and how that affects the drama. Wilson creates an abstract, symbolic dream world, timeless with respect to historical period, or let's say detached from it. He's good at it, and it has a kind of beauty that might serve certain works or parts of works very well. The difficulty with regard to Lohengrin, though, is that the opera is set in a specific time and place, legendary to us, but perfectly real to the characters of the work. There really was a King Henry the Fowler in the 900s, trying to unify and rally his realm against incursions from farther east, and the opera gives us a fair amount of ritual and detail surrounding the events of the story. Out around this historical world is the legendary spiritual one, divided between the Christian one of Lohengrin himself and the Knights of the Grail, and the pagan one of the old Nordic gods summoned by Ortrud, trying to hold on to its ancient ways against the Christianization, its magic trying but failing to overcome that of the Christians. This magical spiritual world is evoked through dream, Elsa's dream, brought into the historical world through a dream transference. That's the central event of the whole first act, the drawing of the emissary from the mythical, magical world, a saving superhero, into the real historical one. And this juxtaposition of worlds and of the intrusion of the magical one into the everyday one is a central theme for Wagner, not only in Lohengrin. But in Wilson's production, we're always in dream world. No sense of worldly conflicts and powers, no sense of the world as stage reality has been established, or the limits on those powers. Nothing exists to be transcended. So in addition to all my other objections, this one sets a seriously skewed precondition in place that not merely tweaks, but actively opposes and displaces those of the work as it comes to us through the text. Well, either one cares about such problems or one doesn't. I think they're crucial. So finally, back to the essay at the point at which I was asked to unpack. In performance, the concept of concept as an image of an idea is inherently anti-dramatic. If the separate elements or particulars have been gathered up in a general notion that can be represented, then conflict has been subsumed as well. In painting or sculpture, conflict can be shown representationally in the subject matter, or abstractly in tensions that can be perceived by the eye. But it cannot develop. It cannot play out. We sometimes call the skilled artwork dynamic. It seems almost alive, but it isn't. It is arrested. In the sorts of conceptual art that include performance elements, living mannequins, television images, and so on, a suspended quality is always evident and is part of its nature by design. Drama is neither a goal nor a possibility. Leaving drama aside, theater is a poor venue for visual conceptualization. It involves people, and people get in the way of the images. Even when an image is fascinating and a person not, the person tends to draw attention, especially with the passage of time. And when people attempt to embody concepts, there is failure all around. The idea disappears into the person, and the person loses all reality and interest, pretending to be an idea. Thus, although in the stage arts, concept is now almost universally assumed to be an enormous improvement on the absence of concept, its very presence, to say nothing of the peculiarities it has spawned, should not be taken for granted. Nor should the modern understanding of the roles of conductor and director. In our practice, these second interpreters in chief, interposed between both the performers and the text and the performers and the audience, given authority over interpretive decisions that would otherwise fall to the performers, and deemed responsible for an overall shaping of the text and the gathering of performance particulars into a unified interpretive statement, hence a concept. But the functions of conductor and director may also be considered as purely coordinative. At the historical extreme, those duties have been reduced to a few tempo indications from the orchestra leader, keyboard player, concertmaster, some cues and rough blocking from the stage manager. In this view, conceptualization is assumed to be the province of the creators and present in their texts, while interpretation is the prerogative of the performers. Production concepts can be determined in many ways. Actually, no competent performance of a reasonably crafted text is without concept. The executive skills of the performers, supplemented by their conditioned expressive responses, will convey enough of the structural and thematic properties of the text to at least suggest a conceptual statement. In current usage, though, a conceptual production is usually one that does not entirely accept the assumptions of the chain of encounter outlined earlier, and does not derive its viewpoint solely from the close inspection of internal evidence. The bounded field of choice left by the creator's text, despite its large territories of unexpressed differential, is viewed as too restrictive, and its conceptual content as somehow insufficient to constitute an appropriate basis for interpretive work. Conceptual authority is therefore shifted from the creator to the second interpreter-in-chief of drama, who changes one or more of the text's premises to arrive at a new version of the work. Now the text is expected to reconcile to the new premises, as are the performer's choices, whose fields have new boundaries. Among the frequently encountered sorts of conceptual production are change of venue, in which time and/or place are altered; point of view, in which some framing device, that is, perhaps a production within a production inside a character's head, intercedes between work and receptor; anachronistic localistic, in which time and place are left nominally intact, but character psychologies and social attitudes are contemporary and parochial; and change of style, in which the scenic environment and/or behavioral manner are removed from that indicated in the text, as with an abstract setting and stylized behavior in a realistically conceived work. But the most provocative contemporary conceptual genre is the adversarial, in which the conceptualizing second interpreter takes the occasion of presenting the work to conduct a critique of it. There is a prosecutorial aspect to such efforts. The aesthetic principles of the text and the philosophical and socio-political viewpoints associated with them are put on trial, and a guilty verdict urged upon the jury, audience, in the very act of supposedly advocating the work. The creator's text is used to reverse his victory. The second interpreter assumes not only the conceptual authority of the first, that is, the author, but the critical authority of the third, that is, the critic, and instructs the audience as to how the work is to be received and incorporated. This extraordinary and unprecedented notion has recently won widespread acceptance. As suggested earlier, these manifestations of revisionism, rebellion, and authorial denial on the theatrical side of operatic production have proliferated at a time when the authority and integrity of the text have been insistently reasserted on the musical, ostensibly restoring conceptual privileges to the creator. At first glance, this is puzzling, but as we look into the case, we shall discover a logic to it. And that is the conclusion of essayette number 11. We'll go on to essayette number 12, episode number 12 next time, and it brings up a subject that has already come into our discussion, but which will now be expatiated on more expansively and precisely, I hope. It's called Eye and Ear. We can think of this unit of coordinated action as a cooperation between push and pull, energy activating outward movement, a pull holding against it. And that's an okay image for many purposes. But in working terms, it's more accurate to speak of an activating pull and a hold against it. If the activating pull has only a little energy behind it, only a little action will result. If the pull overcomes the hold, a larger but uncontrolled action results. And the only way to regain control is to reduce the activating pull, which limits the range, the stretch of the action. It's little again, though under control. If the hold overcomes the activating pull, it blocks the action, slows or stiffens it. Now it's not only little, but also stuck, jammed up. So the only way to create large, rangy, elastic actions is to ensure that all the coordinating muscular systems are strong and in balance and able to remain that way, to stay elastic and responsive under rapidly changing movement requirements. What I hear missing in the great majority of contemporary voices, of both sexes and all types, is what I'd call resistance, the equalizing resistance against the energy being thrown at the coordinations that generate tone. It's missing not only in the big climactic moments that call for an exciting fortissimo, but in the attempts at mezzo voce, which have none of the sense of suspenseful containment, of the tensile quality that suggests something being held within. And the connection between this and the lack of lower register development we are all bemoaning is this: applying every bit as much to male voice as to female, even though we hear it more readily in the female. If the functions of the lower register have not been activated and fully developed in relation to their potential within a voice's framework, then the holding action of that register will not be ready to provide the resistance of the outgoing energies being directed at the voice as pitch ascends or volume increases. It also will not sustain the integrity of the vocal position as activating energy is reduced, as in a diminuendo. The balance of tensions in the interplay among strong elastic coordinations cannot be maintained, and one has a choice between big tone, that is loose, erratic, and approximate, and not evenly calibrated up and down the scale, or tone that is neater and more consistent, but falling short of making dramatic utterances of any significance at any dynamic. Which, with exceptions far rarer than they were in my own lifetime earlier, to say nothing of the lifetimes of my forebears, is where we are today. The next episode, number 11, will be devoted to concept.